Puerto Rico's neocolonial status in relation to the United States is the theological task. That's not, I mean, I really don't need to say anymore. I mean, that is the task. And in many ways, for me, what the Vieques uprisings in the late 90s and the presence of the faith community in those uprisings told me a very different story about Puerto Rico and about resistance and about vigilance than the overwhelming colonial narrative. So that uprising that was really sparked in many ways by the straw that broke the camel's back with David Sanchez Rodriguez's death at that time, the incarceration and recent release of Rivera, and now most immediately in the wake of Hurricane Maria, I believe gives a prophetic opportunity for the birth of a new dialogue and discourse in theology and beyond. The question of coloniality is not simply one of political importance, but it is of spiritual importance. Oscar Lopez Rivera speaks of that as he speaks of his incarceration and the attempts of his jailers to enact spiritucide. That is not homicide, but spirit, the annihilation of the spirit. And in many ways, I believe that our colonial status has done that to our people en masse, both on the island and in the diaspora. And so to not speak about coloniality as a theological question is to ignore the spirit side of our people. Because the question of coloniality is about our identity, about who we are as Puerto Ricans. It's about our salvation. That is, in thinking about salvation, what are we being saved from? And that is our own suffering. And then, of course, our hope for the future. So the reason that this has been such a burning question for me, when I started at Union Theological Seminary in the early 90s, working and studying with people like James Cone and Dolores Williams, I felt a burning sense of wanting there to be a liberation theology for Puerto Rico. And at the time, there were other theological voices coming from the Latinx community. So, so people have asked me, well, why do we need a Puerto Rican theology? Why do we need to talk about decolonization as a central theological frame? And then why do we need to do this now? So let me just first briefly explain why I felt that Puerto Rican theology is important. In my graduate work, I read Luis Gonzalez and Virgilio Elizondo, and Mestizaje, and of course James Cone and others, even from people like Rolando Espín, Damaris Diaz, all are articulating their theological perspective in very profound and important ways, but they were unapologetically emergent from their identity as Mexican American, as Cuban, and that the centrality of their identity was not something that was on the tangents or the margins of their theological content. It was at the center. And while that was all very rich and informative to me, I felt that the question of the coloniality and Puerto Rican status was absent in that. And so really that's what I set the task to do. Another part of it was that the pastoral ministerial community, which Eli will speak about, had been active around these conversations for many, many years. And but that conversation didn't seem to be extending beyond the immediacy of the parish community and the church. And I felt that there was a need to have, not to discount that, but to broaden the conversation. The other part of it had to do with the English-Spanish divide. That was in many ways representative of the island stateside divide. And to be quite honest, in many ways, I was very afraid to even write this dissertation years ago, because I felt like, who am I? You're so young, you know, as a, what did again, I'm in the diaspora. What legitimacy or credibility do I have as a diaspora Puerto Rican to even put forth a Puerto Rican decolonial theology or liberations theology when those on the island have been doing this all along and are living that reality? And what I finally came to realize was, and maybe it had to do with, you know, post-2006 and the numbers shifting to a greater number of Puerto Ricans here on this side than on the island. I said, wait a minute, we are not, this is kind of part of the same tactic of divide and conquer. We are part of one nation and one community. And our experience here is no less legitimate than the experience of those who are island born. And then finally, I have to say that my interaction and conversation with young Puerto Rican scholars in theological and religious circles were the motivating factor to me. They were saying to me, we have no resources within our own study upon which to claim and then to build this particular voice. And so they said, you know, stop being afraid and just put it out there. And that was really what became an inspiration for me.
Got another 5 minutes.
Okay. When it first took shape, I was really thinking about a liberation theology in the same kind of arena as James Cone's Black liberation theology and others. But at the same time, I was really unhappy with that category, because I felt that, well, I felt unhappy about it for two reasons. One was because the language of liberation theology in many ways has been co-opted by the academy. And that co-optation by the academy has made it into another area of kind of discourse, rather than what it really was meant to do as a mode of inspiration that came from the people, that emerged from the ground up. That it was based in, you know, the basic communities in Latin America, and that was what, you know, theology was the second act. But it has not, it had kind of morphed into something else, like the study of liberation theology. And it did not address the colonial status of Puerto Rico. So along came the language of decoloniality that was being kind of spoken in different pockets in the cultural theorists out of Duke University and these other spaces, and even among Puerto Ricanos, you know, Ramon Rosolel and others who were having this conversation on decoloniality. And I thought, wait a minute, those are the voices. I need to start to learn that methodology and put that in conversation with liberation. So it started off as a Puerto Rican liberation theology. It became a Puerto Rican emancipation theology, and now it's a Puerto Rican decolonial theology. And I think the change in the language is not insignificant, because it was trying to get deeper and deeper into the real question of how can we speak about God and our relationship with God and a relationship to a sense of salvation unless we address that which inhibits our relationship with God and ourselves in the here and now. And that is the decolonial question. Even the language of post-coloniality, which is very big in academic circles, is inadequate because we're not post-colonial anything. And then I don't think I need to even address the question of why does this need to be addressed now. I think that that is self-explanatory. So let me end this by saying that in the wake of Hurricane Maria, which has in many ways, as my one of my colleagues, Loida Martel has said, you know, it has kind of stripped the mask of coloniality of the situation. It has cast a spotlight on the imperialistic tactics of occupation that world powers use all over the globe. And so I believe it's an opportune moment to ask this question in relation to Puerto Rico. Is it possible for Puerto Ricans to transcend a colonial imaginary of dependence and docility while living within and maintaining a neo-colonial relationship? That to me is not a rhetorical question. Stated differently, is it possible for the Puerto Rican spirit to be free when the body is bound? I am suggesting here that the subtitle, Prophesy Freedom, delves deeper than proclaiming a particular political status. I am exploring here whether the theological question of identity in relation to God can be reconciled with the political question of Puerto Rican identity in relation to the United States. I am exploring whether the theological question of salvation in Christ can be reconciled with the socioeconomic reality of Puerto Rican people suffering in a poverty-stricken environment. And finally, I am exploring whether the theological question of hope can be reconciled with an overwhelming sense of despair in the Puerto Rican community. As I pose these questions, I am presupposing that in relation to God, all are free, yet in relation to the United States at this moment in history, we know we are not free. But also, as the title suggests, freedom prophesied is freedom claimed in the here and now. No one else can bestow it upon us, and no one can take it away. It is a freedom of our own design and definition. It is our story. We belong to it, and it belongs to us. And so that I hope that in some way it can be a witness of service at this particular moment.
Thank you very much. I invite you to take notes, pose your question on paper, hear our presenters, because we will have adequate time to engage in dialogue about the issue. Thank you, Teresa, for setting a great tone for what we want to do in this session. Next is Robert Rivera, Professor of St. John's, who will reflect beyond specifics of the board to question what should academic religion professors and others be doing right now. Bobby?
Thank you, Dr. Agosto. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here today, and I thank the Centro and the Puerto Rican Studies Association for organizing this important and very timely symposium. My thanks also to Dr. Agosto for the invitation to participate on this panel alongside my colleagues Valentin and Teresa Delgado. As a New York-born Puerto Rican, an academic theologian and scholar of religion, working in, through, and out of the broad Christian tradition, my brief remarks this afternoon focus on the relevance and role of religion broadly and of Christian theologies specifically. So I want to make three broad points. in relationship to the relevance and role of religion. Number one, I think it's fair to say that religion, broadly conceived, has been and continues to be an important dimension, whether for good or ill, of the Puerto Rican experience, both on the island and in the diaspora. This is not to say that everyone on the island and in the diaspora is religious or engages in religious practices. Puerto Rican peoples, through languages, rituals, social practices, constructions of meanings, whether in Afro-diasporic, indigenous, Abrahamic, or non-Abrahamic contexts, have found ways to orient themselves toward this and other worlds, toward the self, speaking of matters of identity, and others, speaking of matters of community, and have been able to resist and subvert imperial and oppressive powers, both on the island and in the diaspora. Religion is, one can say, part and parcel of the everyday, lo cotidiano, of Puerto Rican life. As a child growing up, I was taught, you say bendición to your parents, to your uncles, to your grandparents, to extended family members who are like uncles and aunts, etc. So that's a way of using language as a practice that has a religious dimension to it, right? You ask for someone's blessing, or we can sometimes exclaim, ay Dios mío, ay bendito, ay virgen. These are all expressive of the ways in which religion, to some degree or the other, is functioning in the everyday, lo cotidiano, of our lives. Further, this experience, one can and must argue, has had and continues to have important socio-political implications. That is, while religion has functioned as a way for people to orient themselves, it has also been a means of orienting, specifically a way to govern, monitor, and discipline bodies. Just think of the conquest and colonization of the island by the Spanish and the US, projects aided and abetted by the Christian tradition. Think of the civilizing mission that took place on the heels of the US invasion of 1898. Think also of the ways in which religious, specifically Christian rhetoric, functions to police morality, proclaim cheap prosperity at the expense of the concrete socioeconomic realities of people, and demonize other religious traditions, which is especially problematic when one considers the ways in which this demonization is at the same time racialized. The point of this broad observation is to say that it behooves us to pay attention to the ways in which religion is, whether we like it or not, a reality both on the island and in the diaspora, a reality that can be meaningful and liberating, or can be oppressive and repressive. And so I think, as scholars of religion, it's important that we pay attention to both these aspects of meaning-making, but also the socio-political implications of the ways in which religion is functioning in conversation with historians, anthropologists, sociologists, economists, etc. At the same time, I would hope that our academic colleagues in these fields that I just named would also return the favor in kind and pay attention to the ways that there are scholars of religion who happen to be self-identified Puerto Ricans also working on these matters in conversation with the broader social sciences. Point number 2. Speaking as an academic theologian who works in, through, and out of the broad Christian tradition, I think it's important to note the ways in which Christian theologies have been and continue to be operative on the island and in the diaspora. In the words of Ada Maria Isasi Diaz, whom our colleague mentioned just a moment ago, the theologian, and in this case, the Puerto Rican theologian, needs to exercise what Isasi Diaz calls epistemological vigilance. This means that theologians need to be aware of their own subjectivity and of the ideological biases that may be at work in their own theologies. It also means that theologians need to be aware of the ways in which their theologies, whether explicitly or implicitly, either support dominant hegemonic structures or resist, subvert, and critique those structures which are counterproductive to human and ecological flourishing. So the famous question, who benefits, right, should also be applied to our theologies. Who benefits from our theologies? To what extent? Finally, it means that theologians wrestle with difference and contradiction in a self-critical, open, and honest way. This, Isasi Diaz suggests, can only be done to the extent that the theologian is connected critically to community. It's in this kind of critical connection to community, in this context of Puerto Rico, both on the island and the diaspora, that there's a need to develop, in the words of Luis Rivera Rodriguez, both a teología puertorriqueña and a teología puertorriqueñista. Both a Puerto Rican theology and a theology of Puerto Ricanness. We need theologies that reflect on the God-world relation, taking the Puerto Rican experience, as the work of Dr. Delgado has so ably done, taking the Puerto Rican experience as a direct or indirect source of this way of thinking. We also need theologies that critically reflect on the faith and praxis of Puerto Rican peoples with an explicit option for Puerto Ricanidad, with an explicit option for the Puerto Rican people. Keeping this in mind, I would suggest that Christian theologies, both on the island and in the diaspora, emerge out of the everyday experiences and realities, lo cotidiano, of Puerto Rican peoples, and raises questions about the presence and knowledge of the divine in and through these experiences and realities. What kind of world do we live in and want to envision? How can we think otherwise? I want to suggest that in response to these kinds of questions, a Christian theology from an explicitly self-identified Puerto Rican context, whether on the island or in the diaspora, is prophetic, is critical, and is constructive. It's prophetic to the extent that it speaks a word to the here and the now, and names and unmasks idolatrous realities that are oppressive of the humanity of Puerto Rican peoples. It's critical in that it raises questions about the ways in which theological assumptions can be and are at work that either serve to oppress or serve to liberate, emancipate, decolonize the people of Puerto Rico. And it's constructive in that it can provide a theoethical impetus by which we think of another world possible. Un mundo donde quepan otros mundos, as the famous Bautista saying goes. So to this extent, I would suggest that Christian theology has a significant role to play, particularly today, given the recent events of Maria. We have to be careful with the sort of, while not explicit, the sort of understanding of Puerto Rico as terra nulla, right? As this empty space which nature has taken care of to erase, which can then serve to justify creation out of nothing, creation ex nihilo by predatory companies and corporations that seek to remake and reimagine Puerto Rico according to their own imaginaries. And so Christian theology has to be suspicious of this, name this, critique this, and envision a different way of being. It also works when thinking about the dead. We can think of the ways that Christian theologies have a political economy of indebtedness and can serve to reinforce the making of indebted subjects, right? And so that's something that Christian theology can do in its prophetic, critical, and constructive mode. To this end, I'm pleased to share that at the annual meeting of the American Academy of Religion and Society of Biblical Literature taking place in Boston this coming November the 19th through the 21st, a group of Puerto Rican scholars, both on the island and in the diaspora, have convened a special session to address the current crisis on the island and in the diaspora. I keep saying in the diaspora because when we talk about on-the-ground realities, I think there's also an on-the-ground reality here as well that we need to take into account. Our session is titled Puerto Rico and Maria, Histories and Vulnerabilities in the Eye of the Storm, will raise awareness about the devastation wrought on the island and how scholars of religion need to think about the implications of this for the ways in which we do scholarship. To this end, we're crafting a statement of support and solidarity with the people of Puerto Rico and calling on members of the academic guild, the religious academic guild, to support us by signing this statement, as well as taking concrete action, praxis, and donating to local organizations mobilizing to help bring relief both on the island and in the diaspora. And I don't know if it was Dr. Delgado who mentioned this. We've been chatting on Facebook Messenger, a whole group of scholars of Puerto Rican descent. But it seems that this is the first time in the history of these two academic societies that will have an all Puerto Rican panel in session devoted to issues related to Puerto Rico and the island. And I think that is also a significant moment and achievement that will be taking place.
Thank you, brother. And please explore with Bobby all the panel this whole important focus on how religion matters in practice of responding to crises like the one. And finally, we turn to Reverend Valentin for a presentation on how his local community has responded to crisis.
Thank you. It's great to be here with all of you, and thanks to Dr. Agosto for this was his brainchild. So thanks for doing this, and thank you all for being here. Just to share some brief thoughts, I'll be very brief. I promise. I know I'm a pastor, but I will be brief. So just some thoughts. I think this entire situation with this, I guess we can call it post-Maria world. I have some trepidation seeing that my wife's name is Maria. But I think we are living in a post-Maria world, and I think part of this experiment we're doing today is how do we reconceive our theological language, but also our praxis, which is part of the language, in what we do in light of this situation. So I use the word praxis there intentionally, and as a pastor working in Loisaida, I have taken that concept to heart and see this post-Maria situation calling for urgently for the materialization of praxis, right? Where we take both reflection and action seriously. So I've thought to myself, well, how do I make that happen on the ground with my folk, mi pueblo, in Loisaida, which the Latinos that are there are predominantly Puerto Rican. So the first thing we did was what many other groups have done, is we started a donation drive, and we partnered with nonprofits, parachurch organization, to get this work done. We realized that, I mean, we're here in the diaspora, and I'm going to say a little bit more about Jonathan Soto, who's here, and he is was appointed by Mayor de Blasio to head the very first Center for Faith-Based and Community Organizations, never been done in the city of New York. Jonathan Soto, Puerto Rican attorney and Evangelical, is the first director of that center. And he was one of the people that the mayor sent to Puerto Rico to help coordinate and help with the logistical operations with several mayors on the ground in Puerto Rico. So it's good to see you, Jonathan. And so the action entails literally helping feed our people. And so part of the action is doing that, right? It means building coalitions, bringing together all resources that we have in order to alleviate the pain and suffering that our pueblo is experiencing right now. So as I thought about that, we decided that something needed to be done. And I was so happy to see, I mean, we have people from, I don't know where they came from, but amazing to see the response that we had. And I'll say a little bit more about that. But I also realized that we also need to reflect on the situation and to see that the aftermath of Maria shows that sin has consequences. I'm not talking about sin that Puerto Rico is directly responsible for. I'm talking about the sin of colonialism and the fact that we see a dysfunctional response to the situation is a consequence of the sin of colonialism. So, es un pecado, and we have to denounce it. Now, that requires reflection. And one of the things that we did in our church this past Thursday was to host a forum in conversation with Nelson Dennis, author of War Against Puerto Ricans, and Dr. Sam Cruz from Union Theological Seminary, in order to provoke conversations about the future of nuestro pueblo. So that's the reflection part. And we need to marry the reflection with the action. And that's what Praxis is about. And I plan on doing more stuff because we really need to think about what has led us to this point. And what can we do to not only denounce the situation, but to change the situation on the ground. And it will take churches, religious communities, scholars, elected officials, right, thinkers, to come together and do what needs to be done. And it's interesting to me, I think, what we're seeing, and it's that out of this crisis, we see a rising consciousness. There's an awakening, and pueblo despertado to a certain extent, right? I think that people, and I'm not talking about the actual suffering, obviously. I mean, obviously, that opens a lot of eyes, but it's the conditions that has led to many of the situations that we see now, and the conditions that have been exacerbated as a result of our colonial status. And there's a rising consciousness that we have been screwed for so long, and that something needs to be done. So it is a time of despertamiento. And I think something good will come out of this. Perhaps it is time, and Dr. Delgado mentioned it, perhaps it is time for a new kind of theology of hope. And where would that come from? It has to come from us. From us. So then the question is, the age-old question, where do we go from here? And I believe that where we go is where we get resources from everywhere and do what my own brother has called the creation of coalitional publics. And this time demands that, yes, churches, synagogues, and all religious folk and political philosophers and academics, right, activists come together and build a new theology of hope, build a new Puerto Rico. And only by doing that can we reach what we demand and what we deserve over 500 years. So, que los ayude Dios.
Amen.
Thank you. We have 31 minutes, so we're supposed to stop, which reflects the wonderful time management of our colleagues, and we want to thank you for that.
And our moderator.
So that we can have dialogue. So we've got professors, clergy people here, activists, and I know you all can talk great. But we're going to keep our comments and or questions brief. So for our panelists, I'm going to have the privilege of the first question because I want Reverend Valentin to take a minute for me, we have issues in Hartford collecting stuff and not being able to deliver it to Puerto Rico and of course in Puerto Rico there are issues of delivering the goods to the needed person. So if you could say a word, an additional word about how his church collected, not how they collected successfully. I saw it all over Facebook. Great. The question I have for him, and he has an answer, is to how he got it to the right hand of Puerto Rico. They were about that. We partnered with it. Then we're going to open up to all of you for your questions.
Yeah, and thanks for the question. So there are a couple of ways that we've done, and Jonathan is here. Perhaps he can even say more than I could. But the mayor, at least in New York City here, the mayor has opened up fire department houses to bring donations there, and then from there it's going directly to the island. So maybe Jonathan can share more about the logistical resources that have come into play. So that's one. We've also partnered with NALEC, which is the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, which is headed by, I'm a union grad like Dr. Delgado, but she got her master's and PhD. I just did my master's there. But Gabriel Salguero, who leads NALEC, he's also a union alum. We've partnered with them since they partnered with World Vision. They've been on the ground, and I guess they'll be considered parachurch, right, organization. And they've been going pueblo to pueblo, delivering goods that have come from over here. So we were fortunate enough to link up with them, and we sent our stuff directly to Coney Island, and a boat took it right there to the island. So if you know about World Vision, or you can just Google NALEC, and they've been providing a lot of support on the ground, and of course our city has been doing that as well.
Great. Do you want to get in on this at this point? I'm looking at you. Well,
just
to keep up with the logistics.
Absolutely, I have a question, but in terms of what has been successful is working directly with municipalities. The ports are managed by the governor, and that has been challenging for us to get stuff there. So, for example, we connected Gabriel and folks directly to San Juan Mayor Carmen Yulín. So we entered into a sister-to-sister agreement with the San Juan Mayor, and we've been able to get stuff through there. And now we're expanding that sister-to-sister model with other mayors that I was able to connect with while I was there. So we also opened up a service center in East Harlem at Centro. A lot of families are in need. Jobs, clothing for the winter.
I mean, your families are writing here.
Yes. So we're receiving anywhere from 60 to 70 families per day that are coming to the center. Majority in the Bronx, then comes Manhattan, Queens, I'm happy to connect with anyone on any of these things.
I'm gonna go ahead and say thank you.
And quick question, I do have.
Oh, you have a question?
Quick question.
Come forward, yes.
Anybody that wants to answer this in relation to creating new theology.
Good.
So I feel that, right, Puerto Rico is under the thumb of white ethno-nationalism that Bannon and Breitbart were. Their analysis, which has emerged, has centered on viewing culture as the prime mover. That's why they engaged in culture wars since the early 2000s. And then comes politics, and under politics is actually religion. So in anticipating the antithesis of that movement to kind of break down white ethno-nationalism, my argument is that actually what goes above culture is spirituality. But unfortunately, we've been shaped by white evangelicalism, and just because of the sheer amount of numbers that we have, especially in our Latinx churches, the houses of worship, it is difficult to introduce a liberationist kind of theology that is accessible to the masses without it being besmirched as some communist, Marxist kind of framing. So my question to anyone that could answer this is, I'm in the kind of political public service world, and all I see is how do we create a transcendent idea that mobilizes folks here in the city on embodied solidarity amongst different faiths, and that has been successful, at least here. How do we create a language that allows that to go into different places? And in Puerto Rico, where we have this somewhat insular engagement with faith that feels that A, it may be inappropriate to engage in liberationist discussion, and B, how do we make it accessible from the academic to the people? That way it leads to movement that is not only cultural, but then political, and then our religious apparatus comes out of that new way of thinking.
I think that's a fantastic question, and it's a difficult question. But I think, to me, there is something to be said about the evidence from our own story and our own history that has shown us moments where we've done that.
Mm.
And that's why, for me, like, I think this is one of those moments. Yet it's one of those moments. The way in which the faith communities were able to kind of get out of this individualized piety of religious language that said what's happening with our water is a spiritual question that matters to us. What's happening with unexploded ordinances from the Navy on Vieques and Culebra, that matters to our spiritual life. And I think that as Puerto Ricans, we have a sense that la naturaleza is part of our identity. That I'm going to start to cry, okay? I know.
Yeah.
Okay, that our people, our land is weeping, that we are in lament. That is theological language. How do we come out of that lament? We can't just come out of it by we can't just cross over that lament by some, future vision of a resurrected being.
Mm.
That's not enough when our people are dying and our land is a waste. I think we have the resources within our own history to tell a different story. And the only way through that, the only way I think to combat the culture wars, as you so aptly described, is for us to connect with the land and with each other, and to demonstrate how the land is part of us and we are a part of it, and our own stories tell us how to get through that. But we can't do it by dismissing what's happening with the naturalness. I spent the earlier part in the environment session, because to me there is no theological language that emerges from this moment that is not connected with the land. And we've sort of, maybe because 5.8 million of us are outside of the island now, and that we are on this island, right? And which is a concrete island, and we don't have the sensibility to, right, we know it. We know it.
Thank you. This is delicious. Thank you so much. Are you been having fun with this, brother?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. Excellent. I'm at Yale this year as a PhD visiting researcher, so it's great. Thank you very much. So I have a couple of comments, suggestions, and then 2 complete questions for anybody who is called to. So I think that, there's no coincidence that this was called Huracán María. And the word huracán is a word that comes from indigenous roots. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And as a theologian, always looking for meaning and hermeneutics, I feel there's a calm there. There's something, and what Peter just shared with her, the Delgado about the roots and earth. And huracán was like that God. But the Delgado said, what is this going on that just has to be a God, has to be a deity that wreaks havoc, right? And I just came from Puerto Rico. I just came 2 days ago. I'm right now working with Park Avenue Christian Church, and we did some one-on-one collaboration with solar kids. And we went to Centro de Burgos, shelter for married women there, and took solar flashlights and solar phone chargers, etc. It's the same with Centro Salud para el Puerto, which is a center that provides acupuncture and basic health accompaniment to people in plazas. So we're also donated some solar lamps so that they could hold their clinics under tents. And also with Juan Rosario, who has working with ecological movements and reaching out also other leaders within in Evangelica that are still just moving work with people. So just to put that there, that's one thing. And I think one-on-ones, that kind of collaboration with organizations or municipality, that's going to shift the paradigm, because it's decentralizing and it's creating new movements. So how about starting a jubilee movement for the elimination of the debt? That is biblical, that's theological, that's something I think we can do, and perhaps that's something that we can get a lot of people on board. Similar movement with, the Rican situation of prisoners as well. So we have some memory there of things that we have done. I think that there's something, I think we need to decolonize Christianity too. We were colonized with Christianity, and I think this is a moment to decolonize it and really become interfaith. So going back to Huracán, why is there something that indigenous spiritual tradition can teach us here to bring us more connected to our roots and our earth and our Junke and I can cry as well. So I'm about to cry. The same with Afro religions, Santeria, and it's maybe it's a moment to be dialogue and find the similarities, which they are. There are many similarities to these are actually, Santeria, there's one God. They have different deities, but you have one God who's the God that creates. So it's very interesting. So there was one more thing. Oh, the other thing, I think is very important. In this process of decolonization, we have the external oppressions, right? We have the empire and how the empire moves. But we have, the thing with oppression is that it's like a virus. After so many years, we internalize it. And I sometimes think that we're at a point in history we can no longer denounce with that, like the external ones without denouncing the internal ones. And it's not coming from shame, and it's not coming from mediation, and it's not coming from self-oppression. It's coming from responsibility and empowerment to there. So in which way, as a Puerto Rican, I've internalized it so much, that it's affected us. And this crisis talks about that. The reason that we have this electrical crisis is because things were not done when they were needed to be done. And yes, we have the superpowers and we have the corporate greed and but sometimes we acquiesce to that. And we say yes, but we should say no, or we should still find smaller alternatives. And right now in the ground, even just to get many, one example.
And then you'll
So solar companies, great, let's do solar. So they've hiked the prices. So what used to cost $1,000 now is $5,000. So people are, Home Depot, an extension cord that used to cost $30 for people to help each other with generators from house to house, they hiked the prices to $80, $90. So, how do we say no to that? And how do we intervene as religious leaders with companies that we know to say, no, I'm sorry, we're gonna put a stop here, and we may not do that. And so there's a lot of different levels, and I also want to encourage us to think about strategy, really in the plural, because we all will have different passions and different callings and different connections, and how do we move intersectionally at different levels to help us all?
Thank you. Any response,
Just
please?
two quick comments. One to your first observation with regards to Rican. Perhaps the time is ripe for a comparative theology, right, of creation from the Puerto Rican context. I mean, what would the Genesis narrative of creation look like if read from Afro-diasporic, indigenous, Abrahamic, non-Abrahamic context? I'm thinking, can the Spirit be thought of as another kind of Huracan? Right? And the Spirit of God moved upon the waters. Right? What would that look like when taking into account this kind of perspective? So that's one, and I think, that's a good dissertation or article, etc. Secondly, with regards to the ways in which colonialism is internalized, I think going back to this suggestion by Ada Maria Isasi Diaz is calling for the ever-present need to be epistemologically vigilant. We need to decolonize our minds. Right? And so perhaps, as our colleague suggested, the question, the task of a Puerto Rican theology is to decolonize, right? Not just as a socio-political reality, but also as a personal, psychological, free the self. Free to be free in relationship to the land, free to be free in relationship to my brothers and sisters, free to be free in relationship to the ways in which I orient myself to the world and other worlds. So I think you're right. We need to be thinking about these dynamics simultaneously. And that calls for the ever-present reality of vigilance, self-critical reflection, which I think in some ways could even speak to some of the realities that Jonathan brings up. When we think of, say, for example, the US invasion of 1898, it's no coincidence, and I'm sorry, Eli, I'm sorry, Teresa, and Gabriel, if you're out there listening somewhere, that major leaders of Protestant denominations gathered at Union Theological Seminary with maps in hand to think about the ways in which they would each, right, reap benefits.
That's what I mean, took place there.
It took place at Union Theological Seminary.
And those are, and the recordings of those, are archived at Union.
Oh,
So,
that's amazing.
All right,
I'm gonna have to-
excuse me, I'm sorry to end this. We have to set up for the next discussion. We're at 2:45 now. We just have the next discussion at
So
3
we're till
o'clock.
3.
What?
Are we till 3?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought, okay, all right. I apologize for interrupting.
Lisa, and then if you have something to add,
Yes.
please. Go ahead. Did I get you right, Lisa? Or Lisa?
Lisa Olivero,
Okay.
Professor Boricua College, the only Puerto Rican institution in the United States. The president said he tried to find out what happened to his grandson, who's Puerto Rico sold. I'm trying to find out what happened to my sister and other relatives that I was not. But I want to come back to very touched by each of the speakers, particularly what you were saying, Delgado. And as you were all speaking, what stays on my mind is something that's happening with a generation of Puerto Ricans on the island. They're going back to their roots, going back to their roots to feed the community, going back to their roots looking for water, going back to their roots with King. doing what their grandparents did 50 years back. And that's causing sustainability
Right,
from house to house en los pueblos pequeños. Y me imagino también en las montañas.
right.
So I'm suggesting from that, as a recent grad from Theological Seminary, what is going on when people instinctively go back to something that was worthwhile? And now they're thinking community, not the I. When in the United States, a lot of Puerto Ricans are disconnected because we've become what is called that nuclear family of separated but single. We're not connecting together, as we say in the literature. Puerto Riqueño, the extended family, la comadre, todo eso. You know, in Puerto Rico, people are coming together back to those roots. So why can't we, while they're setting that example to us, yo estoy bien, como el jíbaro dice, coming from a humble place and religiously doing the same thing. Porque yo he visto personas orando y levantándose las manos. We were doing that at our United Methodist Church last night because that is the church where the young lords took over and served breakfast. And a lot of those persons, including Felipe and Luciano, benefit from it. Gerardo Rivera también. They didn't come back to give to the church, but they benefit from it. Right? So I'm saying, instead of exploiting ourselves for the singleness of ourselves, is there something we could do so that those persons who are talking about values, lo está haciendo instinctively, that we could make a connection so that it's not just left by itself. Maybe we could start reminding ourselves where we're coming from and start becoming one instead of ustedes por allá y nosotros americanos puertorriqueños acá. How can we come together so they hear us? Brother, sister, I know what you're going through because I'm feeling it. But how can we come together religiously, non-religiously? Because we have non-believers and believers.
Sure.
But there's something that goes across all of it that can bring us all together. And there has to be something that we can address, whether it's from the church or whether it's from the institution. Because we've been monopolized too much by many institutions. But there's got to be something. And there is a strength that I'm feeling from the island every time I see a little vision of these Puerto Rican women rolling up their sleeve. Mira, aquí yo empiezo, vamos. Because what did a particular person say about us? They're just waiting to be taken care of, and that is not true. So I want to bring dignity back to my people. They're setting an example that I can't even put into words, but there's something we can do besides feeling it and loving it. And my compassion is here. Can we draw on ourselves together and stop judging each other based on position, but go back to our resources so we can connect them?
I think that's some of what you experienced in the Lower East Side. It wasn't just your church, right? It was like,
Yep.
Well, thank you for the gathering. Thank you, everybody. I'm a dance artist and I do work in places like Union Theological Seminary. It's been very in this conversation, very inspiring what you said. And one of the frustrating things is that we get this information from scholars and academics, and it's like, what can we do? What can we do immediately? Okay, we didn't know specifically that it was going to be that particular company in Montana that was going to do the electrical. But why weren't we prepared for the next day to do some kind of action? I don't know what the action is. We know it's going to be constant. So that's just like a thought that permeates my thinking. And then I was very inspired by what everybody said. And I was thinking, so if you go to the Catholic Church, no, they're not gonna let you do that Directo way of saying God. But it was very inspiring to hear what Rivera, Delgado, that we need a new creation myth. So wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to do that creation myth? And I go, well, what places of worship are gonna allow us to do this? And just thank you, I got the answer. From you, Middle Collegiate Church, and just the whole idea that we need to bring all our resources, including the arts community, And when you have theology and religion at its best, it's fueled by great art. I mean, the reason why we still go into Catholic churches, even if we're not connected to them, is there's this thing about architecture, music, that truth lives on in that, and we need to really bring the best kind of artistic practices into this this time in history, which we always have. By the way, it's present. So it's about bringing,
But even in spite of the porqueria of the institution itself.
right.
Amen. Bobby, and then I want to see us before Bobby's show of hands. We have 8 minutes left. I want to see who else wants to say. The brother here, anybody else wants to say a word or two before we close? Bobby.
And I think that would be a wonderful opportunity to draw on the resources that the people themselves have within them to contribute to this kind of imaginary. Because if, according to Gordon Kaufman, theology is imaginative construction, right? Well, that imaginary isn't going to come solely from texts, right? Academic texts talking to other texts. Is going to take people like yourself, bringing the arts to help us think creatively and develop an imaginary using the cultural resources available to us through music, through arts, through food, through dance. We're very tactile people. And so I think that would be a wonderful opportunity to develop this kind of imaginary drinking from our own wells and drawing on our own.
And
That's a
and
great
that's
point.
one of the reasons that, for me, telling or contributing a Puerto Rican decolonial theology meant going to literature, going to our own stories. So it's not, it's as Maria Santiago, it's, Pedro Juan Soto and Rosario Ferre, who are the storytellers of our own people and of our own suffering, our own identity, and of our own hope. That form the foundation of this decolonial theology.
And those are the conversation partners.
That's exactly right.
We have 7 minutes and 3 hands that I've seen. The brother from the Covenant Churches,
Yes.
Bill Rosa, and then the sister over here, and unfortunately that was the end of our dialogue. Well, not the end of the dialogue, the end of the session. Go forward.
So my name is Jorge Fontanes. I'm a congressional lay leader with the Collegiate Church, social entrepreneur and resident. We are doing some things and mobilizing, launching a campaign tomorrow. I'm happy to speak to that if that's helpful. But I'm coming from a session on grassroots organizing. And from that session, there were 3 points. And I'm curious to think of a call to action for this week also, with the question being, what is our rallying cry that would support this movement now? So what was discussed earlier was to rally on November 19th, Sunday, which is also Puerto Rico Discovery Day, which I learned on so Latinos en Marcha on the 19th, more and more are coming together. We are talking about mobilizing buses and taking a page out of the Women's March to have it be intercultural, intergenerational, interfaith. What is our rallying cry? 2, what is our rallying cry with respect to this idea of proposing the Marshall Plan for Puerto Rico? That's the language being used for the policy to address Title III and debt and all of the things that would potentially delink us from this colonial status, at least financially. And then the 3rd was in support of the grassroots organizations on the ground who are actually frontline and are more empowered 40 days later than they were the day after the hurricane. So my question, kind of wrap all that together, is from a theological perspective, thinking about also this idea of interfaith, what would be the rallying cry that you would want to see folks speak to?
Thoughts on that? I know that Bill Rosa is thinking about some of this rally.
So part of something, and you're serving with Reverend Lewis.
Yes.
So I've been in conversation with her.
Great.
As well, and also I have union. I don't know which day I have it, but I'm going to plan something. So maybe we could talk about, maybe if there's an email list, we just do something there.
Yes.
Get it coordinated on a calendar, and if it's prior to the 19th,
Yes.
maybe the call to action to that day may be to engage folks and create some type of platform. So I'm happy to collaborate with whoever's convening here on there. And it's funny, I was speaking with Reverend Lewis Thursday about ways to support, so maybe you and I can talk and expand on that.
Great. Bill, if you would share a little bit about what you're up to, and then we have one more comment. And then
Well, basically, we have an initiative called the Health Safety for the Resource Initiative. We're in this for a long time. Interesting in listening to the talkers. I am conservative Pentecostal Evangelical, very much aware of what you're saying, and it is that particular group that we're going to draw out. I have a response to your question, because I've been thinking and reflecting upon this for years, okay? So we need to get together, and once we organize it, we can do something, okay? But basically, the initiative, okay, is basically gathering the religious community. By the way, we have an organizer of the Women's March who's going to help us organize our event, okay? We want the church, all the church, to invite the rest of the Puerto Rican community to participate in what we're calling an event of historical event, okay? And that is all the building of the coalitions, all of the different interactions. The church has a role. Anyone who has studied sociology knows that there is a function, but there's also the theory of conflict. The church has a role to play. So I've been wanting to challenge the theological community, okay, to do theology not from the armchair, but out in the field, okay, where people are crying and sweating, okay, and doing what they have to do. Because the church can serve as a beacon of hope, a spiritual light, a moral imperative, and a light in moments of darkness, as the way that we're experiencing right now. There's going to be a lot of dialogue, conversation. In fact, let me just read this thing. As elected officials in the media, religious and community leaders of business and academic communities publicly debate, discuss, navigate the uncertainties of the current president and his administration's plan and commitment to rebuilding the island of Puerto Rico, we, the Puerto Rican people, are going to make sure it gets done, okay? And what this means is this. Many of you are exceptional in your field, okay, and accomplished, but this is going to require that we become extraordinary, that ordinary people become extraordinary. And not just leadership, we've got young people. We walk around the streets, you talk to, I'm sure you know this, they're disoriented, whatever you want to do, professionals. We as a church can play a role in providing that spiritual light, that spiritual inspiration to get the people doing what they have to do.
We want to hear more about this, Bill, and I think you've given us, I think dialogue with the brother here, dialogue with Centro there, and other leaders. I think we've got a great idea. This is for the spring, so beyond, and for Washington, March on Washington. So we got the New York piece for November, we got the Washington piece for the spring, and I think there's people here that can dialogue about how to do this the right way. And
my name is Sonia Figueroa Paran, first generation born and raised here in New York City. It just happens to be that my daughter and I were in Puerto Rico vacationing when Irma hit and my aunt hit. And the disconnect was so profound and so deep that my question to you right now is there a strategic plan in place for collaborative communication with theologians here on the mainland and the theologians on the island?
So that's been part of the initiative underway to bring a group of scholars together next month in Boston at the annual meeting of the American Academy of Religion and Society of Biblical Literature, is to have voices both on the island and here in the diaspora present at this meeting to speak to the realities of Hurricane Maria, to the broader realities of the U.S. colonial relationship with Puerto Rico, and to think about decolonial futures. So we have been in dialogue with theologians on the island.
And will it be open to the public? Like,
that meeting
will there be?
That session will be.
Yeah, we can get you the information. So this is the annual professional meeting of professors of religion, right? gathering somewhere. And this year we organized a session, Sunday evening. And we here at Pagan and others from Puerto Rico who are able to be there. Friends, our time is just about up. Actually, it is up. There's a sign-up sheet for email, so we can connect on November 19th and down to Soto's office and the Rosa's initiative. There's wider than girls, of course. And the final word for our session is Jared.
Thank you. When I came from Puerto Rico, Toluca, who is a very popular radio station that's getting a lot of information, they developed a plan. Puerto Rico se levanta, and that's placed like every, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes. So it's interesting talking about the arts, that in the midst of things were worse than I thought, but they're better because of things like this, the community are helping each other. My mom did not want to leave. I couldn't convince her to come, so I decided to just support her and her community. And it's interesting how the community, the concept of community is really fun. And I think there's a lot of hope. So I just wanted to just end with that. Puerto Rico se levanta.
Thank you.